Hi guys, welcome back to the Female Genius podcast. Guys, I'm in such a good mood. Before I film a podcast episode, I feel various different ways, but most of the time I like to come into the episode feeling like an intellectual, feeling okay, we're gonna have some good ideas, good thoughts, good phrasing, great articulation of what you're saying, minimal ums and ahs and minimal things that don't make sense. So like I prep my brain in a way where it's like, okay, Jesse, we're in smart mode today. Before I just literally sat down to record it, I was listening to Midnight Sun by Zara Larsson, aka the unofficial official song of the summer. Guys, the way I was bouncing around, can you hear how out of breath I am in my room? There's something in that song that feels like rainbows and lollipops and just like it's a sun ray, it's like emitting from your body. It's crazy. And you know what? Let me give her flowers, okay? Let me give the women of music their flowers. Women have been carrying music for the past like 5 years. Genuinely, like they have been eating the men up on a ridiculous level, and it's currently been a thought in my mind about like what is going on, what are we doing here, boys? But I don't even care because like for real, what are they doing for me anyway, this is not how I wanted to come into this episode, but I wanted to tell you guys what level and energy that I'm on. Okay, guys, I was rereading for the 15th millionth billionth time Shakespeare Macbeth, aka one of my favorite Shakespeare plays of all time. A very close second. Somebody asked me, like, what is second? I think probably Much Ado About Nothing, but I think I have very strong attachments to Shakespeare plays that I have worked or interacted with in like an extended capacity. So obviously Macbeth, I did it for GCSE English. I have so many fond memories about studying that in class and just thinking about it in general. Much Ado About Nothing was the first play I musically directed when I was at Cambridge, and that was so much fun to work with the composers, to work with the musicians, to like work with the actors and directors. It was such a collaborative effort, and it was like my favorite theater experience working in that frame space ever. I've done other plays, Shakespeare. I think I did Twelfth Night, but I don't really like the plot that much. But Much Ado About Nothing was so much fun. I love Much Ado About Nothing. But Macbeth still centers in my mind time and time again, and it's a play I reference all of the time, not only because of my days in school, but because it contains one of my favorite female characters across all of like I'm talking like movies, media, books, like everything. I have this obsession with Lady Macbeth, and it's like so unreal, my obsession with her as a character. And obviously I think she's one of the first female characters that I analyzed because we did her in like year 7, and it was the first female character that I analyzed that felt like it had depth. There was so much meaning and layers, and I think working and talking and learning about Lady Macbeth in English literature back in year 7, and then from that day forward, I'd never looked at a female character in a play, in a movie, the same way again. It really, really changed my perspective and my dynamic and the way I interact with the female characters that I experience on screen or in books or in other formats. And I just, the level of depth is crazy, right? And one of my favorite things about Lady Macbeth as a character is she often sparked many debates in my English class, right? With the conversation about her role, what Shakespeare wanted her role to be, and how that changed over time, and her power in such a male-dominated sphere. And she just enthralled me. I mean, oftentimes Lady Macbeth is talked about as a catalyst of evil. You might have heard certain certain critics calling her the fourth witch. And so a large conversation is she's used to showing what happens if you give women too much power, what happens if you give women a voice, right? And that's probably a very traditionalist perspective of Lady Macbeth as a character. I mean, she utters one of the most harrowing lines and soliloquies in Shakespeare's work, that almost sounds like a spell. And it's like, tend on my mortal thoughts, unsex me here, fill me toe top full to the crown with direst cruelty. Like she was spitting absolute like Right. But then on the flip side, if you look at it from a slightly more feminist perspective or a more nuanced perspective per se, you can argue that Lady Macbeth is a product of the patriarchal constraints within her society. Her evil, her inherent quote unquote evil is not born or because she's been given too much power, but is because she has been given a lack of it. And the only way for her to get what she wants, to access the positions that she wants, is through her husband, right? It's through Macbeth. And so she's not necessarily evil. She is just trying to manipulate and work within a system that is built to work against her. I mean, like in her soliloquy and many times throughout the play, she references and attempts to distance herself from traits largely associated with femininity. I mean, there was one where she was like, for you, Macbeth, I would like dash a baby on the floor. Like, for you to get what we want. That's how much I love, that's how much I'm in this, right? And her ambition and her love for Macbeth is intertwined into something quite twisted. And that is something that I find so interesting. I mean, you could even go into detail about the dynamics within their relationship and the love in their relationship. We often sometimes see Lady Macbeth painted as like manipulative, but I think that she just loved Macbeth to a point where it was almost a little bit twisted. Macbeth was a vehicle for her to achieve power, but she also wanted that same power for him. She cared for him. And anyway, I could talk about Macbeth forever and forever, but the point I kind of wanted to get coming across at the beginning of this episode is that women often hold very specific roles within storytelling mediums. Typically and historically is been used to bolster male characters and provide softness or development as a result of the characterization of the woman, whether it's through a romantic relationship, humanizing a character, or through making a man be positioned as a hero, or, you know, challenging certain constraints within society. Right. The characterization historically of women and typically suffered as a result of being forced and constrained to the male gaze. I don't know if you've seen that interview with Anya Taylor-Joy. I think she was promoting the movie The Menu. So good. So that's a great movie. And in that, she was talking about how she's often disgruntled by the representations of female rage on screen, right? And she talks about how, you know, a lot of the times when we see women get angry, it's usually like a silent tear falling down her cheek and she just walks away, you know. But she was like, no, women get angry, they get mad, but I thought that was quite interesting because I was like, that's so true, but yet so often or so little we see that represented very well on screens or even in real life. When a woman expresses anger in very similar ways that men are permitted to express anger, they are often labeled as crazy or too much or that is unnecessary. I mean, if we look towards the recent season of Love Island USA, the conversations around Huda and how she expressed her anger and her disappointment and her frustrations towards male characters, I don't want to call them characters, they're people, male contestants on the show. There is a large conversation about how and what is the appropriate way for women to act and to be and to show emotions, particularly anger. And in this episode, right, I wanted to get into it. I kind of wanted to talk about the representation of women, but in true female genius fashion, because I can never just do it normally. I was like, okay, so where does it come from? So we're going on like a really serious deep dive into this concept of women and this relation to their emotions. I'm going to stray away from neuroscience. Imagine me saying I'm straying away from neuroscience in an episode. I'm going to stray away from neuroscientific discussions about the presentation of women because, number one, it's a lot more nuanced than women are more emotional, quote unquote, than men. I don't necessarily believe that. I think there's a lot of socialization and also our perception of how we perceive emotions may affect these things. That's point number one. Point number two, there are lots of different things that feed into women's emotions, including their cycles. And there's just lots of stuff that I just don't have time to get in today. But I promise I will get into it eventually. I might do a mini episode talking about, you know, women's emotions from a scientific point of view. But this whole notion that men are smarter than women from a structural brain perspective is wrong. And this whole notion that women are slightly more emotional than men in terms of like raw feeling and experience, which number one, I always think is a very flawed argument because how do you measure something that's inherently an individual experience? But that's besides the point, is something that's like null and is down to the individual. And women might be more emotionally in tune, they might be more empathetic and things like that. But I would argue that's a result of socialization. So that's my little disclaimer. We're going to be talking about history and media and film and books, and it's a fun flipping episode. So Enjoy, geniuses!
Female genius.
For centuries, women's portrayal and display of particular emotions have been policed and used as a tool of method and control to keep women from stepping out of patriarchal norms. And a brilliant example of how that has been done is through the witch hunts that happened during the 15th to 17th century. The West was a highly religious society, right? But despite this, it became a way of controlling and demonizing these women who were unmarried or outspoken or living outside of patriarchal norms that showed a sign of too much intelligence, suspicious amount of intelligence for a woman, because of course a woman can't be intelligent, right? Oh, a woman is mad that her husband cheated on her and she's crashing out. Oh no, she must be a witch. That's too much. Women are kind and feminine. They can't show these kind of emotions, right? It was used as a tool to wrestle power away from women. A great example of how this was done, we can then turn towards Katharina Hennot, who was born in Cologne around the late 1500s, right? She was from a very well-respected family, and she became one of the very first female postmasters in the region at the time. And by postmasters, she was basically in charge of all the postal services. How people got and received their information, she was largely in control of that. This was a extremely very powerful position, and it was a highly sought after position by many, many men and people in the country at the time, right? In 1627, during a spike of witch hunts in German states, Henot was accused of witchcraft, obviously, because she was a woman, she held position of power, and she was unmarried. This also you could consider to be politically motivated. Some historians argue that the German government or the Cologne City Council at the time, I'm not particularly sure, I'm sorry, the Cologne City Council at the time wanted to wrestle power away from the Henot family, and if they were to accuse Henot of witchcraft, they can begin to take charge and control of the postal services. She was arrested and imprisoned and continually tortured to try and extract a false confession from her. They were trying to get her to confess to being something that she wasn't, and they were also trying to see if she would name people that other witches that she could have potentially been working with. And despite the lack of evidence and the lack of confession, she was still burnt at the stake a few months after that. And there are many, many cases across history during those times where women were unjustly accused of being a witch just because they did not display traits that women expected of them. It was a use and a way to police women and to keep them in control and to keep them in a line. If we then go and look a few years forward, we can look past the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment is typically when, people start taking science on board. Science starts being taken seriously. And, we have large amounts of industrialization, and religious paranoia has started to dampen down a little bit. But that doesn't mean the witch hunts haven't stopped. They have just been moved from religious explanations to medical diagnoses. So, for example, you would typically have Victorian doctors diagnose women of something called hysteria, which framed women's emotional and mental health disturbances as stemming from a defunctive reproductive system. Okay, you would have symptoms of hysteria also included anxiety, irritability, having sexual desire, too much sexual desire. A woman shouldn't have that. Fainting, insomnia, excessive speech, and being annoyed, political agitation, aka anything that falls outside of patriarchal norms of what a woman is expected to be. You would be branded with hysteria. And treatments included enforced bed rest to like weird shit like having manual pelvic massages by the doctors. Okay, and hopefully that would heal their reproductive system and get them to be more like a woman again. Even if we look towards like the late 19th and early 20th century, right, women were admitted to asylums at crazy higher rates than their male counterparts for behaviors that honestly were just simply standard fare. This included postpartum melancholy, overexcitement, or imagine reading too many novels. I'm telling you now, I would have been got so quickly. Even without me being an absolute bookworm, me and my outspoken self, they would have been like, witch. She crazy. They would have gotten me a really, really long time ago. Social stigma around feminine independence and emotional expression continued to shape diagnosis. And in addition to this, many treatments had become about restraint and isolation rather than helping women get over said disorder. So despite that, if we tend to look away from, just perceived men thinking women acting normal or crazy, and we look at women that were actually suffering from mental disturbances, they were treated in ways that weren't really productive to helping them get better. I was watching Buccaneers the other day, which is a show on Apple TV that's set around these similar times. Such a good show. But in the show, there is a large commentary about a husband having absolute control over this woman, even to the point where she had a child and that child wasn't hers, it was his. And that man had absolute control, so much control that he could admit her into a psychiatric institution without, against her will. And she was not allowed to leave. Her sister, her mother, anybody couldn't have come and get to her because she was the property of her husband. That is just an illustration, an example of how much power man had over women and how much policing men did of women's emotions. If you can imagine being in a time where speaking out or saying too much or being overly expressive would get you locked up in a mental asylum. Now it makes sense that those stains have still been left in the way we perceive and treat and manage emotions to do coming from women, even within our media landscape and even how we relate today in the world. I would argue that cancel culture has become almost like a modern witch hunt. And we police women who act in ways, or we find different phrases and we say, okay, well, now we're going to remove, our public support of you. And I'm not saying it should be considered when it's actually really serious, when people are supporting systems and regimes that are extremely dangerous. Of course, we should not continue to support them. But I'm talking about, oh, wow, this girl, I can't think of a really good example. Wow, this girl just seemed, super passionate. I just don't like the way she speaks. She just kind of comes across as a little bit angry and a little bit bitchy. Let's no longer stop supporting her. It's very interesting the type of conversations that you have around women in media currently nowadays, right? But nonetheless, if we look at this progression from witch hunts to medical diagnosis of hysteria during the Victorian era, things have improved, which is true, but the stains and remnants of centuries of suppressive control and policing of women's emotions continues to remain, right? Even in very casual remarks of social perception, in really, really, really tiny ways sometimes. I remember in primary school, you guys know me. I am very outspoken and very clear, and I've never felt afraid or disencouraged, especially like you guys think I'm crazy now. Imagine me as a 10-year-old. I've never felt very disencouraged or afraid to share my opinion or to share my emotions and thing, right? And similarly, I would encounter boys who had similar behavior to me, but they were called boisterous or assertive or displaying leadership qualities. And me personally, I'd be called, particularly by my male teachers, not one female teacher called me this. It was one male teacher. I will never forget this male teacher, because after that I was like, this guy is horrible. I can't stand him. People were crying when he left the school. I was like, good riddance. I was such a petty child. But I remember he used to call me bossy all the time, and he would go, nobody likes a bossy girl, Jessie. Like, stop. And I was like, maybe I was annoying, maybe I was a kid, but how many boys in your life do you know that's called bossy? Like little things like that. And I don't want to say it's directly linked to, the perpetuation of witch hunts in the 15th to 17th century, but I do want to say that we are highly more critical of women's emotions, particularly when women portray negative emotions, than we are of men.
Female genius.
Now we've done, after my little history lesson, I'm not even like that much of a historian. I have friends that are real history like nerds and geeks, and I always appreciate them. I stopped doing history in like year 7, but I think it is super important to look towards history because, again, history has a pattern of repeating itself. But I largely think that history has a pattern of repeating itself because people don't understand and know their history. And so I make an active effort when I do certain episodes to take time, or if I read certain things or I watch certain things, to take time to learn the historical background or where that came from and how that progression came from, because you can learn so much from the mistakes of others. My sister loves to say this to me, and like, bro, whenever she says it, like, I rub my eyes, but there's an element of truth in it, whereas like you see better on the shoulders of those who have gone before you. So, history is super duper important. But I want to particularly talk about the presentation of women's emotion in film and media. Film and media have so much power in our collective consciousness as a society. It has so much power in shaping our thoughts, our opinions, what we like, what we don't like, what we are attracted to, and also our moral compass, what we deem as bad and what we deem as good. And so I think it's very important when talking about feminine emotions and the portrayal of feminine emotions to talk about film and media. And so before we look at very like specific like media and stuff, I kind of want to get into specific archetypes. And what you would typically find in a lot of stories, whether it's books or in film, you would have particular archetypes of female characters pop up again and again. Remember when in the beginning where I was talking about how like for a long time women's characters were utilized in a way to bolster their male counterpart stories? They typically fall into some of these boxes, right? Number one, you have the Madonna, right? This is somebody that's pure, that's nurturing, the ideal perfect portrayal of femininity, kind, soft-spoken, surrounded by animals, like pets the little rats as she goes on her way to work, right? Sometimes it's often coupled with another archetype that we typically see and are familiar with, aka the damsel in distress. That's self-explanatory. A damsel, so feminine, soft, and sweet, that needs rescuing by the male hero. The male hero goes on this journey to rescue this damsel. It shows he's strong, he's courageous, and when he typically gets the damsel, he is rewarded with her love and appreciation and a kiss. And we've seen a subversion of these many times before, but we'll get into the subversions in a second. Okay, typically she's ultra feminine, the Madonna or the damsel in distress, and she is rewarded at the end with love, safety, or a family. I have an opinion about the Madonna and the damsel in distress as well, but particularly more so the Madonna. I used to be very, very hypercritical of the Madonna character and the Madonna archetype within media and film until I was listening to, would you believe it, Pretty Lonesome by Madeline Argy. And she basically talks about how, I can't remember what episode it was, but she was talking about how women play certain roles in society and act in a certain way because for a really long time, that was the only way for women to survive, right? And so it's a mechanism of survival to play into these roles, to play into these characters, to occupy that space in a world where you have very, very few casts to play. I look towards Cinderella. When I was younger, my dad used to call me Cinderella. I used to piss me off because I was like, do not compare me to that lazy girl, Like she was scrubbing floors and she was just getting beat down, and then she didn't do anything until this magical fairy godmother like tapped her on the shoulder and gave her a chance to go to the party. And thank God she was pretty enough to woo the prince so he can come and take her and save the day, and she was escaped from her rotten family. I said I would have decked the stepmother in the face. Don't talk to me like that. Like it's crazy. And my dad was like, well, it just shows, when you like put up with things and you suffer and you are a hard worker, you will be rewarded eventually in life. And I was like, no, like she could have gone out and done something, gone and seen a lawyer, got a part-time job. But actually, the older I get and the more I sink a little bit into the concept of nuance when it comes to approaching perceptions of female characters, I don't think this was the intention with Cinderella at all. But this is like now how I perceive her character. Is again, Cinderella was probably written and is set in such a patriarchal society and a setup. She doesn't have a lot of power. She doesn't have the power to go wrestle the rights of her, her inheritance from her stepmother. She wasn't protected by her father, right? When the stepmother moved in, like there was so many little consideration for her as a woman. And so she tried and played her role as best as she could and tried to find happiness within the life that she was forced to play in. And I'm not saying she is my favorite representation of a woman character, but I think there is a level of nuance I now apply when I think about the Madonna in very specific and certain situations. But ultimately, for a really, really long time, the Madonna was just used as this is how you be a good woman. And if you are a good woman, you are rewarded with love and a family and a safe house. Okay. Similarly, on the flip side, of course, if you have the Madonna, you are going to have the whore or the femme fatale. Right, she is seductive, manipulative, sexually empowered. Think Catwoman, right? And she is seen as the ultimate form of temptation to lead our hero off their original path, or alternatively, as women mostly are used in a lot of stories, to act as a reward for our hero succeeding, right? He gets to bask in her sexual prowess. And we tend to find or hear about this as like the Madonna whore complex, which is a cultural tendency for society to split women into these binaries, right? You're either the Madonna, the perfect example of a loving woman and wife, and you should be wifed and treated, or you're the whore and you should be seen as something for sexual conquest, like in those kind of efforts. You also have some other archetypes less spoken about. You have the shrew or the nagging wife. This is the woman who is hard done by the world, and she's, super duper like critical, and she's like a bitch basically, or she's the wife that's like, you need to go find da. And she's holding the male character back. And a large amount of storylines that involves the shrew is through a man's love and patience, she changes and becomes the Madonna. The shrew is never supposed to remain the shrew. Either she's ostracized by the society or the community in which her story is being taken place in, or she is converted to Madonna through the love and the acceptance and being told how to be a better woman by the man. And finally, you have the manic pixie dream girl, which is something of a very new, slightly more modern archetype. And she is the girl that's different from all of the other girls. And she perceives life differently, and she's a bit whimsical, and she just needs to float around, and she serves as almost like a guide to the male character's exploration of youth and as a coming of age story. And a very important part of the manic pixie dream girl daydream is for them to realize they need a Madonna and not the manic pixie daydream girl. The manic pixie dream girl is like the whole femme fatale, like slightly modernized, but the inherent basis and use of the character has not changed. And so these are some of the very traditional archetypes that we've seen, and how some of the roles that media portrays and places women in society. However, thank God, through the power of female directors and the female gaze and women fighting, we now have women are now able to tell stories on the big screen with a layer of nuance. They are just not just the wife and the nurturing mother. They turn out to be a murderer. And they're fighting on the sidelines. You might have a whore, but there is reasons behind her story. And you know what? She's very intelligent. She's very smart. She's very hardworking. You might have somebody be the shrew, but the shrew has a very long-time partner that is obsessed with her and loves her. And that does not take away from the aspect of her being hypercritical of society. There are so many characters and archetypes that now have interwoven a layer of nuance, largely because women are now allowed to have a say in society. I would also argue, this is a thought that's actually just come down to my head, like I haven't written this thought down, but I would also argue that I think, especially since women have now become to enter working roles and jobs, it's now become more important for better representation of women when it comes from a financial perspective, because women are spending money on these stories. Women majority fan bases are some of the most profitable groups ever. Look at BTS, look at Blackpink, look at K-pop, look at all of these things, because women will go out and buy. They'll go out and sell. They'll do girls' nights in the cinema. And so from a profitability basis, I guess it makes sense to begin to tell good stories, because people will criticize a story for having a very poorly portrayed woman, and they will like demonize people from seeing it. So maybe that is an aspect that I've considered, but also more women are telling their story and telling beautiful, different conversations.
Female genius.
I want to look at and talk about a really good portrayal of the nuance and the complexities of being a woman by looking at Greta Gerwig's Little Women. And Little Women is a beautiful exploration of girlhood through the lens of four sisters, Jo, Meg, Beth, and Amy, and how their past deviates and how they have to tackle various parts of life and constraints from society as they are women. And there are so many moments in that movie, especially Greta Gerwig's portrayal of all of these characters, that show so much nuance and consideration in the characters' thoughts and feelings and emotions. And even in moments where you can see and navigate these women's emotions being policed, there is so much nuanced around that conversation. And I think towards one of the most famous quotes, and you've probably seen it from the movie, where in Little Woman, Jo, who is impassioned and wants to be a writer, grows weary of constraints of patriarchal society. And as angry tears fall down her face and she's pacing in utter frustration, she says, women have minds and they have souls as well as just hearts, and they've got ambition and they've got talent as well as just beauty. I am so sick of people saying love is just all a woman is fit for. I'm sick of it, but I am so lonely. And this, again, is such an amazing and textured scene and speech and expression of feminine rage, because not only is she trying to struggle to hold herself back, but you can feel her anger. You can feel her frustration on the screen. You can visibly see it. It's not one silent tear while she looks effortless and beautiful. She is laying her heart and her feelings and her thoughts down on the line, right? It's not, her tears are not passive, they are furious. And if you witness this scene, you can see her be active. It's such a, from even without her speaking and just visually watching it with your ears closed, it's such a scene that portrays the built up anger and frustration from patriarchal constraints. And even if we look at the context and the content of the speech, much rather, it's so layered because it has this undertone and understanding of trying to articulate this duality that women have struggled and resisted against for time. The quotes, they have souls as well as they just have heart. And this attempt that the desires, the wants and ambitions men have, women also do have, sometimes in tenfold as well. But despite this, and despite all that she wants in this life, she is extremely lonely because she cannot, or much rather she refuses to align herself with how the world wants her to be and how the world sees her because of the vessel in which she inhabits. And she must walk a path that at that time was not well trodden to live the life that she truly feels like is befitting of her. And she, in this moment, expresses the full extent of how humanity and the way society has been constructed has robbed her of that. That is deepness. That is complexity. That is interesting, right? You have so many moments. Like, we can also look towards Amy March, which is her sister, who in a moment is defending her desire to marry for money and not love. And she has this beautiful intellectual speech, right? But in this moment, she's composed, she's logical. She doesn't portray, a highly emotional version of herself like Joe does. And that's not to say Joe's portrayal of that emotion is incorrect. I'm not trying to say this is a better way to portray the emotion of anger, but it's interesting to look at the fact that in Joe's speech, she's saying this to a woman, but in Amy's speech, which I'm about to read to you, she's saying this to a man. And so she intentionally calms herself down. She presents herself as logical. She says, well, I'm not a poet. I'm just a woman. And as a woman, there's no way for me to make my own money, not enough to earn a living or support my family. And if I had my own money, which I don't, that money would belong to my husband the moment we got married. And if we had children, they would be his, not mine. They would be his property. So don't sit there and tell me that marriage isn't an economic proposition, because it is. It may not be for you, but it certainly is for me. And again, this portrayal, and like there's so many layers, I can speak about this, the portrayal of this specific type of anger imbued with so much logic and coherency. It's an intentional choice for Amy to make sure, hey, to the man that she's speaking to, I hope you understand what I have to put up in a society of patriarchy, and how this society is built has robbed me of all of that. And inherently, Joe and Amy are saying similar things. They're talking and discussing about how society has disallowed them from having certain opportunities, but they're portrayed in very different ways, right? And I just also want to say, there was so much hate. There's so much hate for Greta Gerwig in general, and I will go to war for Greta Gerwig. But there's so much misunderstanding of when we have feminist speeches like this, or we have movies that inherently center women, that this is about man hating. Oh my God, the feminists are coming after the men again. And how much rage and how lack of understanding of the rage portrayed by these women, our patriarchal society, is often a response of being unheard, from being unseen for so long, for being told that this emotion is bad, or you're bossy, or you can't say this, or you can't do this, whether it's inherent, like explicitly or implicitly by society. And so it's important to have a sense of media literacy when consuming things, and how stories are constructed, and who benefits from how certain women's emotions are portrayed. If we see women that have that nuanced perspective, not only women that are emotional and cry and get angry and mad and pissed and throw things, right? And are logical and are cold and, sweet and loving all at the same time, we begin to see women not as just these archetypes that society has set up for us, but we begin to see women as human. We begin to see women as people. And I think, to conclude all of this, I am a deeply emotional person, but like many women in society, I've been taught that my rage or particular emotions coming from the vessel in which I inhabit on this earth has to be presented in a specific way, where I'm always beautiful and I'm always feminine. I always have to be likable when I'm saying the things I'm saying. And it's so interesting because I wonder, and you guys can tell me, because I know men listen to this podcast, how many men feel like they have to be likable when they're expressing their rage, when they have to, intentionally, and I'm saying this not, again, in order to even like be taken seriously or to be heard when I'm expressing certain emotions, or, the depth and the weight of certain emotions, I can't cry. Like, I feel like I have to surgically detach myself from emotions in order for me to be taken seriously. And even then, I have to attempt to prove my intelligence to certain groups of men for them to even hear what I'm saying, or to hear whatever I'm saying and hold it with a certain amount of weight. Ultimately, I hope this episode and this exploration will allow you as women who are listening to this, and also men, to begin to think and feel a sort and perceive, and just like take a moment and think like, wow, is my reaction to this person screaming on Love Island, actually because of their poor behavior? Like, do you get what I mean? Like, to have a layer of nuance when we're consuming people's emotions. I'm not saying that, calling people a bitch and running up and down and being super angry is the correct way to express a woman. Like an emotion, but I want to acknowledge that rage is a valid emotion. But like, what happens after you scream? Like, what emotions are you disallowing yourself to let out and not even, release in a constructive and productive way? And the fact that so many women have been provoked to anger, and we disavow them, we like cut off their voice because they are angry and because they are women, it's something extremely dangerous. And I just call us to think a little bit more about it. Anyway, I'm gonna be late to my workout class. I hope you guys enjoyed this little exploration about feminine emotions and rage. And for this episode, my homework to you guys is to find a movie. Maybe a movie written in the 1980s and watch that, and then watch a movie that's been released in the past 5 years. Do one from a male director and one from a female director, and kind of perceive and look about the way in which women were portrayed. And is there anything you notice, like, wow, yeah, I mean, there are some brilliant subversions of many of those archetypes I spoke about before. Like, we can talk about Shrek. Shrek is a great one. It plays on that damsel of distress notion a lot. And you see a lot of cartoon child movies. I mean, the recent Super Mario Brothers movies, like, Mario's like, I'm gonna go save Princess Peach. And she's like, sir, I got this. Like, you're a kid, like, stay at home. And so we see that a lot, like subverting that damsel in distress notion and that character. Even with the shrew, again, we have subversions of those characters. I mean, look at characters like Wednesday and the Addams Family showing like, oh, actually, you can be a little bit weird. I don't want to change you though. I just want to love you for what you are. And also, you have so many Disney princesses where love is not the primary goal and development and reward for the character's journey or quest or good behavior. It's to learn about themselves. It's to grow for themselves. It's to gain friendship. And all of those different things. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this fun little episode, and I will see you next time on Female Genius. Bye, guys.
Female Genius.